Hello and welcome to our presentation for this JALT 2020 conference. Our presentation has the title Emergency Remote Teaching Reflecting on Practice, and it was conducted down in Kumamoto at Sojo University. Our research was guided by two research questions, which were what were the experiences of 10 teachers at the university in responding to educational challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic? And two, what are some implications of these teacher experiences for future instructional practice and institutional planning? The presentation is organized as follows. We begin by describing the reflective practices in which we engaged, and this is followed by a description of our educational context. We then describe how we did this research before summarizing the findings. So teaching and learning are transformed by changes to practice and the resulting important reflection. Focusing on the process, we observed the experiences of 10 teachers, including our own, and attempt in this presentation to provide an in-depth description of the context as well as the teacher responses, which we've compared in the analysis process. Through experiences of uncertainty and change, we examined evidence in the analysis to make interpretations and seek meaning. We end the process by describing how action may be implemented following reflection on what we've learned in conducting this research. This process and the summary of what we've learned may be interesting to other teachers and may resonate with their own experiences during this period. The research was carried out at Sojo International Learning Center in Sojo University, which is a private university of approximately 3,700 students. There are no language specialization students, but students in the first and second years take compulsory English language communication classes. And there are two 90-minute classes each week in 15-week semesters. To support learning, there's extensive use of e-learning and a large, well-resourced self-access center. There are 19 English language teachers working in this department. Like in other centres, in this educational context, we faced a delayed semester start of 4 weeks. The period before classes started was marked by policy changes about how we would proceed with the semester. It was confusing and at times frustrating for teachers. After some time, the university committed to online classes and teachers were able to work from home, although several teachers conducted their classes from the centre itself. The adjustment presented challenges in communicating with students, particularly at the beginning in making them aware how classes would be conducted. It was also challenging working in teams and sharing ideas, although this was made easier by familiarity with Microsoft 365 applications. During the 4-week online period itself, there was further confusion in mixed messaging from the university about how the remainder of the semester would be conducted. And there seemed enthusiasm among some in management for a return to face-to-face classes as soon as possible. Teachers and students in the second year curriculum team, the focus in this presentation, had the advantage of familiarity with Moodle learning platform, given its extensive use in first year classes on which these students have studied. The addition of a big blue button application for live classes presented some additional challenges in terms of tech and app settings. There was some inconsistency also in how students attended classes, but we were flexible in recording their attendance as long as the work had been completed. The curriculum focus for learning during this 4-week online period was on reading and vocabulary relating to the students' majors. And the curriculum was divided by major, with one teacher in the curriculum team developing content for that major and then sharing it within the same kind of major focus sub-team. Most teachers taught students from 4 different majors, so this had the advantage of easily dividing the workload. Following the 4-week online-only period, a hybrid face-to-face and on-demand system was introduced. Students attended 1 class a week and completed 1 class on demand. However, that period is not the focus of this presentation. Any questions on these modes of educational delivery or on the educational context are welcome at the end of the presentation, and details will be given later. In brief, the following slides present the online system we used during this 4-week period. Students log in to the site's Moodle page. And each course has its own home page, and highlighted in this top section is the live online class link. Students select that link and are then taken to this big blue button page. And here is where the online live classes were conducted using video and shared screen facilities. Then using BBB, the teacher could direct the students to the Moodle home page and the particular lesson for that day. And students would find a series of tasks for them to work through independently during the class. Moving on to an overview of the methodology selected, we used a qualitative and interpretive approach in this investigation. 10 teachers took part, but their participation was not compulsory. To elicit data, we used semi-structured interviews, and the average interview length was about 20 minutes. These took place remotely using Microsoft Teams, which had the facility to auto-transcribe the interviews. However, several quality checks were required afterwards. Data were protected within the group. Indeed, nobody from outside this team had access to the interview recordings or the transcripts. And in the report, the data is anonymized. Several individual and collaborative coding checks took place. And finally, the data was analyzed thematically. This slide presents an overview of this overall process. Firstly, we identified the need for this research and developed some early research questions to guide the process. Then we arranged and conducted interviews. Transcripts were then checked individually and shared with the interviewees. Then we worked independently on a kind of first coding process using emergent codes. We then met to collaboratively develop this coding framework. We then went back to the transcripts using this framework to code again. And then there was sharing of these transcripts and further checks. This led to the refinement of the research questions and this final part in this process, which is to summarize the research which took place. Before presenting the teacher stories in the data analysis section, it is useful to briefly present the questions asked in these semi-structured interviews. And those were: how would you describe your teaching experience this semester? How did you expect online classes would go? What did you do in preparation? Did things go as you anticipated? What worked well? What challenges did you experience? Is there anything you would do differently? What did you discover that could be helpful in your future teaching practice? And how would you describe your overall experience this semester? Teachers were also given the chance to provide any additional comments. Following analysis of those interviews, the following coding framework developed, divided by 3 categories: experiences of online learning, factors of influence, and possibilities. And in this presentation, we focus on categories 1 and 3 to address the particular research questions in this presentation in relation to teaching and learning experience and future changes. Dave and Johnny now present findings in relation to the first category. Given the option that any viewer may have in pausing the video to focus on the supporting extracts, these sections summarize what we learned.
Most teachers were generally very positive about the levels of student engagement during the online classes, and noted that many students seemed happy working independently. They also mentioned that some of the stresses of face-to-face learning were removed during this time. These stresses included the need to engage communicatively with other students or with the teacher, and that the English course was perhaps the only time where this is required, with the added difficulty of the communication happening in a foreign language. However, other teachers noted some difficulties, including students having difficulty accessing materials, students not having enough time to complete activities, and that it was often difficult to monitor these students. In terms of communicating with students, both within and outside class times, teachers were once again generally very positive. Many admitted that they'd been apprehensive about this aspect of online classes, but were pleasantly surprised with how things evolved. Although all students have had university email accounts, the use of these has been somewhat irregular, with many departments having their own systems of communication with students. So SILP teachers felt that establishing a consistent channel of communication with students was particularly important and something they hoped would continue. In terms of in-class communications, teachers also mentioned that students seemed more comfortable using audio or text chat rather than the traditional face-to-face communications they had been used to.
In an interesting contrast to the items coded as communication, which were quite positive, responses that were coded as feedback on activities were much more nuanced. Students had to enter the online classroom with videos turned off, so teachers reported that their usual methods of gauging students' reactions to activities were now obsolete. Teachers had to explore new data-driven channels for feedback, including the polling function, where they could ask students directly about their experience, or activity completion monitoring. Teachers expressed a lack of faith in this data, however, and reported that the data wasn't sufficiently illuminating for them. Obviously, everyone's experience of this course was mediated through the technology that we used. Teachers reported feeling a great deal of uncertainty about the tech tools before the start of the course. However, they also reported that they were pleasantly surprised that their worries were unfounded and that things were a lot smoother than they originally expected. Some teachers seemed to be quite adventurous in their use of activities and resources. Others preferred to stick with what they knew, but teachers generally reported learning more about the system as the course went on and expressed a desire to know more and improve this aspect of their practice. Teachers reported changes in both teaching practice and admin procedure. Most teachers reported being able to handle the new admin side of the job with little difficulty, though it was more time-consuming than before. In terms of classroom practice, the changes brought about by COVID and the school response to COVID were more problematic. There seems to have been a lot of trial and error. Teachers reported initial attempts to apply an approximation of their usual practice, and that those attempts were often felt to be unsuccessful, which necessitated regular re-evaluation of what works and what might work in the online classroom.
Reflection is not only about looking backward, but also about looking forward. The potential implications of our teaching experiences during the pandemic for future instructional practice and institutional decision-making are discussed in the next two slides. On a personal level, although some teachers viewed the remote teaching experience as an isolated incident in their career, other teachers perceived possibilities for professional development upon reflection on their teaching during the pandemic. As reported in a previous slide, the teachers saw the value of technology in teaching. The first and second excerpts here showed that the teachers realized a need to equip themselves with knowledge and skills in instructional technology. They also considered the teacher community as a professional resource that provided support for implementation of technology. Beyond the personal level, The teachers talked about long-term changes in institutional management and decision-making, and in how the curriculum is delivered and received. Some teachers argued that the confusion and frustration they experienced when teaching remotely were a result of a lack of clarity about how decisions on institutional policies were reached, and therefore they expected a more simplified and transparent procedure of decision-making. This point is illustrated in the excerpt of Teacher 1. Still, some teachers indicated that the remote teaching experience revealed the potential of blended and online learning. The relatively quiet activities such as reading could be done online, and face-to-face sessions could be used for more interactive activities. Learning opportunities and options could be provided not only in the silk, but also beyond the silk.
Returning then to research question 1, and what were the experiences of teachers and how did they respond? Some were largely positive about perceived improved student engagement. Communication had been a concern, but the use of a single consistent mode of communication was seen as beneficial. However, there were technical and logistical issues, as well as issues in monitoring task completion and learning problems. And new data-driven channels for feedback were required, since it wasn't possible to gauge understanding in the moment in class. Experiences using technology were mixed, and some anxiety was evident among teachers, although this eased as the online period carried on. So a reflection on what worked and what didn't took place individually throughout the process, and bringing these reflections together to compare and contrast is a useful process, since experiences of uncertainty and how teachers responded to change varied. Some teachers appeared to respond more effectively in adapting practices and expectations, while others were more fixed on maintaining their existing practices and were, it was interpreted, less successful during this period and more frustrated. Returning to the second research question on implications of these experiences for future instructional practice and institutional planning. Some teachers viewed the period as isolated, as something to get through, whereas others took the opportunity to work on their own professional development, particularly in relation to e-learning. At policy level, it was evident that some teachers found it difficult to work in these circumstances, requiring clearer messages on instructional aspects, although given the circumstances, the ambiguity may not always have been avoidable. Nonetheless, transparency over decision-making and simplified messages may suit a number of teachers in this setting. A benefit of the period has been in presenting to a number of teachers new skills and new learning opportunities enabled by e-learning, and this may inform their individual planning decisions post-COVID, as well as potentially influencing future curricular decisions. While we have sought patterns in the teachers' accounts, it's still important in research such as this to represent teacher views and experiences which are clearly personal and highly variable, that we acknowledge, as represented by Teacher 1 here, that different points of view exist. We may not all be correct, but teachers are invested in the work they do and respond differently. So the research is important, since the role of reflection in teaching practice in looking back is critical in order for us to continue developing and improving our practices as we move forward. We thank you for your time in looking at our work, and we welcome any questions. Thanks.